In the last video on Berkeley, basically what I did is I went over the sensations that Philonos gets Hylas to admit that are mind dependent, and basically what I want to do here is kind of go over a little bit of the things in the treatise concerning principles of human knowledge by Berkeley, and talk about the abstraction of ideas, and talk about how that relates to idealism, and maybe see some problems with it. The abstraction of ideas is abstracting what we perceive into primary and secondary qualities. A primary quality is that which is extended. It is matter. It is real, absolute, objective. While a secondary quality is mind dependent, and it is, it's subjective, and it's the qualities of everything that is perceived by us. And Berkeley is kind of critiquing metaphysicians before him, and saying that this little abstraction is kind of, it's kind of not nonsensical, basically, and that it's kind of wrong, and that there's really nothing more to what we perceive than what the properties are. There's nothing more to everything that we perceive than what the properties are of the things we perceive. Basically, the objects that we perceive have properties. He kind of has a bundle theory of properties where the properties together are what make up particulars, and all that a particular is what the properties are. The properties collected into one make a certain particular, and there isn't anything more to a particular than what its properties are. He says in section 5 of part 1, for can there be a nicer strain of abstraction that you distinguish the existence of sensible objects from their being perceived, so as to conceive them existing unperceived. And he also says, I'm reading out of the Modern Philosophy, an anthology of primary sources, which is edited by Abreu. To be convinced of this, the reader need only reflect and try to separate in his own thoughts to be convinced of this, the reader need only reflect and try to separate in his own thoughts the being of a sensible thing from its being perceived. From what has been said, it follows that there is not any other substance than spirit, or that which perceives. The reader need only reflect and try to separate in his own thoughts the being of a sensible thing from what is being perceived. So, abstraction of ideas. What the non-idealistic metaphysicians are trying to do is they're trying to think about, or they're trying to argue that there is a being that is separate, or that is related to. There's many variations of realism, but it's basically saying that there is a being, an objectively real, absolute being that is related to the things that we perceive. So in Kant, for one, who follows Berkeley, says that when we perceive something, say this cup, there's a phenomena, which is what we're really perceiving, and then there's a noumena which is behind it, which is something that we really can't get at. There's also variations that that well, it's just basically the whole thing. It kind of follows for any realism that the realist metaphysics is basically going after thinking of the things that we perceive as separate from the actual being of them, the actual being, the real absolute objective being. And what he's saying is that this is not possible because what makes up the things we perceive is the properties themselves, the properties themselves. And how we like what could the absolute being be made of, since it's kind of hard to it's kind of not too easy to get out, but I desire anyone to reflect and try whether he can, by any abstraction of thought, conceive the extension and motion of a body without all other sensible qualities, because that is what they are trying to do. That's what they're trying to do, and that's what he's arguing. That's what he's arguing against. That they're trying to think about some kind of real, objective, absolute reality, which is beyond, and at least somewhat, or maybe not at all related to the things that we actually do perceive. So what Berkeley is saying first of all that the things we perceive have properties. He's claiming a bundle theory of properties, where the thing that makes up a particular is the properties and only the properties. The collection of properties is what makes up the particular. And what he's getting at is that how can we think about a real objective reality when we don't have anything that is, we don't have any properties that are of that, for one, and we perceive a plethora of properties and sensory qualities that are things we actually perceive. So how can we move beyond what we actually perceive when we don't perceive anything other than what we perceive? How can we move beyond what we perceive if we don't perceive anything other than what we perceive? Basically, that's kind of a mouthful. Those who assert that figure, motion, and the rest of the primary or original qualities do exist without the mind in unthinking substances do at the same time acknowledge that colors, sounds, heat, cold, and secondary qualities of a similar kind do not, which they tell us are sensations existing in the mind alone, that depend on and are occasioned by the different size, texture, and motion of the minute particles of the minute particles of matter. Basically, what I'm trying to discuss here is that he's making not only a metaphysical claim, but also a epistemic claim. The metaphysical claim is that since we don't perceive anything other than what we perceive, we can't. Then there really is no realm of absolute being, because we don't have any perception of such. And the epistemic issue is that even if there was such a realm of absolute real being, how could we have any knowledge of it since what we perceive is dependent upon the mind, as is shown in the dialogues, or in the first dialogue at least. So how can we kind of even think about this at all? And his conclusion is that everything that we perceived is dependent on the mind. And since we can't conceive of a realm of things that are mind independent, how can we even think about that? How can we even do this abstraction of thought? And his conclusion is a full idealism, which is basically that everything that everything we see is dependent on the mind. So thus there's no matter, there's no extension, there's no bodies, there's no any of that real absolute being stuff, because we can't get beyond what we can't get beyond what we perceive to even talk about it. First of all, we have no metaphysical grounds of claiming such a absolute real world, or a real absolute objective world beings. Second, if there was a thing, if we had metaphysical grounds for positing such a real absolute being, how could we even know about it, since we only perceive what we perceive, and if we have no perception of this real absolute world, then we can't have any epistemic, we can't have any epistemic contact with that. And the conclusion, as I said, is idealism, according to him. And the question is this, I in my personal opinion, the points he brings up in the first dialogue, as well as the principles, are noteworthy, and they are important. And there is still, realism, speculative realism, moral realism, and all these kinds of realisms, where, in my opinion, I'm personally not an idealist, but I'm more leaning towards like a phenomenological theory of minds and perception. But the problem is, I think that the way he comes towards his conclusion of idealism is correct because how can we have any knowledge of such a real absolute being, or a real absolute kind of being? I mean, we can't really. So, and yet people talk about always, and yet we have no evidence or way to really talk about it, and we're just speculating. It's kind of like people who do that, I feel like, they're kind of grasping in the dark because they have no perception of what they're talking about. At least empiricists and phenomenologists and logical positivists, and many other variations of those, have a basis to talk about what they're actually talking about. And they're not going to, talk about things that they have no perception of. But is the right conclusion idealism? And I would say no, primarily because, first of all, what he argues is that we have no way of talking about or thinking of a real absolute world, or real absolute kind of being. So things are mind dependent. So since we have no way of talking about this kind of real absolute being, or real absolute existence, real objectivity, how can we have a way of talking about subjectivity either? I think he's right that since sensations are dependent upon the mind, but I think just as much as we have no business talking about whether something is mind independent, we also have no business of talking about whether a cup or anything else is mind dependent, because we have no knowledge of whether anything is either. We have no. Because of how he shows that the doctrine of abstract ideas is totally wrong, and it's just bad, which leads to the idea that we have no business talking about real objectivities and real mind independent things. On the same token, we have no business talking about whether something is mind dependent. And so personally, I would lean towards the conclusion of a phenomenological bracket or a phenomenological reduction, because they stop asking those questions. They stop asking the question of realism or idealism. They stop asking the questions of mind dependence or independence, and they go with phenomenology. Goes with a stance where we're just going to go with the things themselves, or to the things themselves is the mantra or the dictum of Edmund Husserl, because we're going back to the phenomena, not phenomena in the sense of there being a noumena, but just that we're going to talk about what we see and only what we see, and not think about mind dependence or mind independence. So that's pretty much a lot of what Berkeley discusses. Not about phenomenology at all, but that abstraction and the way he gets to his full idealism. I think like I said, the way he gets there by showing the foulness of that abstraction, the abstraction between primary and secondary qualities, the abstraction of the things we perceive, and the real absolute being that is behind it, or is related to it somehow. It's just kind of wrong. It's kind of all wrong, and it's kind of is difficult metaphysically, and it is difficult epistemically. So yeah, let me know what you think about this, because it's just kind of, I just don't really like the conclusion as much as I like the way he gets there.